John F. Kennedy believed in reconciliation. He believed in reconciliation between North and South in this country, which is why he campaigned in all 50 states, even before the official campaign began, and regardless of the fact that there were many in the South who did not appreciate him because of his membership in the Catholic faith. He believed in reconciliation between black and white. And as president, he became the first president since Abraham Lincoln to declare to the country that centuries of treating our black citizens as second class through discrimination and segregation must end, and he was sending comprehensive legislation to the Congress to accomplish that. He believed in reconciliation internationally between the northern industrialized world and the southern developing world. And in his inaugural address, he extended a hand of hope and friendship to those whom he described as living in mass misery in the huts and villages of the world. He believed in reconciliation among members of different faiths. And not only was he the first Catholic president of the United States who extended a hand to Protestants and Jews as members of his cabinet and team, but as president on an international scale, he not only supported the, at those days, relatively new nation of Israel, but also began a correspondence with the new president of Egypt, Abdel Nasser, to show that the United States wanted to be a friend to peoples of all faiths around the world. It was the height of the Cold War. But Kennedy, in his inaugural address, though best remembered for declaring that we in this country will support any friend, oppose any foe, pay any price, bear any burden, which are the lines people remember, in that same inaugural address, extended a hand to the Soviet Union saying there's so much we can do together. Together we can explore the stars. Together we can tap the ocean depths. Together we can push back the desert. We can fight, he said, we can combat the common enemies of man: poverty, misery, illiteracy, disease, tyranny, and war itself. It was October 16, 1962, that he called me into his office in the morning to say that the Cold War, the competition between the United States and its Western allies and the Soviet Union and its communist allies had reached the most alarming point that it ever had, because the Soviet Union had suddenly, swiftly, secretly installed nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba, 90 miles off our shore, that we had to assume it was done secretly and swiftly because they intended to use those missiles either to devastate our country or other countries within their range, or to use them as nuclear blackmail, making an important sudden announcement at the United Nations that fall warning that the missiles could and would be used unless the West turned over West Berlin, which was by accident of war a little island of freedom inside communist East Germany, and therefore might be the subject of that kind of nuclear blackmail. And John F. Kennedy then began a series of decisions, and each decision demonstrated that he was a man who preferred reconciliation to war. The first decision he told me about when he called me into the office that morning, and that is that he wanted a meeting that very morning, not of the National Security Council, on which the generals and other hawks in government would be well represented, but instead he wanted a meeting of a particular list of a dozen or so whose judgment he trusted, whose recommendations he wanted, not because we were all experienced in nuclear confrontations. There had never been a nuclear confrontation. The second decision he made when he gathered that dozen or so of us together in the cabinet room later that same morning of October 16, and didn't say, "What's the military response?" No, he was a man who wanted to know all the options, and he insisted that we give him all the options and the pros and cons of all the options, not merely military, but also diplomatic. And not only unilateral, but multilateral, because he was a believer in alliances and a believer in the United Nations. The next decision was, consistent with that last note, to make certain that this matter was briefed to our allies and presented to the United Nations Security Council. And those of you who have seen the movie 13 Days know that our ambassador to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson, did a very forceful job of presenting America's case against this installment of nuclear missiles 90 miles from our shore, an unprecedented move by the Soviet Union. They had never before permitted their very secret, powerful missiles to be stationed anywhere outside their own territory. And the next decision that JFK made was to actually quietly communicate and, in a sense, negotiate with Soviet Chairman Khrushchev. That was against all the conventional military thinking at the time. The Soviets were our enemy. You're not supposed to communicate with the enemy, you're supposed to blow them up.